Yoked with an Unbeliever by Rudyard Kipling. When the Gravesend tender left the P&O steamer for Bombay and went back to catch the train to town, there were many people in it crying. But the one who wept most, and most openly, was Miss Agnes later. She had reason to cry because the only man she ever loved, or ever could love, so she said, was going out to India, and India, as everyone knows, is divided equally between jungle, tigers, cobras, cholera, and sepoys. Phil Guerin, leaning over the side of the steamer in the rain, felt very unhappy too, but he did not cry. He was sent out to tea. What tea meant was that he had not the vaguest idea, but fancied that he would have to ride on a prancing horse over hills covered with tea vines and draw a sumptuous salary for doing so, and he was very grateful to his uncle for getting him the berth. He was really going to reform all his slack, shiftless ways, save a large proportion of his magnificent salary annually, and, in a very short time, return to marry Agnes later. Phil Guerin had been lying loose on his friend's hands for 3 years, and, as he had nothing to do, he naturally fell in love. He was very nice, but he was not strong in his views, opinions, and principles, and though he never came to actual grief, his friends were thankful when he said goodbye and went out to this mysterious tea business near Darjeeling. They said, "God bless you, dear boy. Let us never see your face again." Or at least that was what Phil was given to understand. When he sailed, he was very full of a great plan to prove himself several hundred times better than anyone had given him credit for, to work like a horse and triumphantly marry Agnes later. He had many good points besides his good looks. His only fault was that he was weak, the least weak little bit in the world. He had as much notion of economy as the morning sun, and yet you could not lay your hand on any one item and say, "Herein Phil Guerin is extravagant or reckless." Nor could you point out any particular vice in his character, but he was unsatisfactory and as workable as putty. Agnes later went about her duties at home. Her family objected to the engagement, with red eyes, while Phil was sailing to Darjeeling, a port on the Bengal Ocean, as his mother used to tell her friends. He was popular enough on board ship, made many acquaintances, had a moderately large liquor bill, and sent off huge letters to Agnes later at each port. Then he fell to work on this plantation, somewhere between Darjeeling and Kangra, and, though the salary, the horse, and the work were not quite all he had fancied, he succeeded fairly well and gave himself much unnecessary credit for his perseverance. In the course of time, as he settled more into collar and his work grew fixed before him, the face of Agnes later went out of his mind and only came when he was at leisure, which was not often. He would forget all about her for a fortnight and remember her with a start, like a schoolboy who has forgotten to learn his lesson. She did not forget Phil, because she was of the kind that never forgets. Only another man, a really desirable young man, presented himself before Mrs. later, and the chance of a marriage with Phil was as far off as ever, and his letters were so unsatisfactory, and there was a certain amount of domestic pressure brought to bear on the girl, and the young man really was an eligible person as incomes go. And the end of all things was that Agnes married him, and wrote a tempestuous whirlwind of a letter to Phil in the wilds of Darjeeling, and said she should never know a happy moment all the rest of her life. Which was a true prophecy. Phil got that letter and held himself ill-treated. This was 2 years after he had come out, but by thinking fixedly of Agnes later, looking at her photograph, patting himself on the back for being one of the most constant lovers in history, and warming to the work as he went on, he really fancied that he had been very rarely used. He sat down and wrote one final letter, a really pathetic world without end, amen, epistle, explaining how he would be true to eternity and that all women were very much alike, and he would hide his broken heart, etc., etc., but if, at any future time, etc., etc., he could afford to wait, etc., etc., unchanged affections, etc., etc., return to her old love, etc., etc., for 8 closely written pages. From an artistic point of view, it was very neat work, but an ordinary Philistine who knew the state of Phil's real feelings, not the ones he rose to as he went on writing, would have called it the thoroughly mean and selfish work of a thoroughly mean and selfish, weak man. But this verdict would have been incorrect. Phil paid for the postage and felt every word he had written for at least 2 days and a half. It was the last flicker before the light went out. That letter made Agnes later very unhappy, and she cried, put it away on her desk, and became Mrs. Somebody else for the good of her family, which is the first duty of every Christian maid. Phil went his way and thought no more of his letter, except as an artist thinks of a neatly touched in sketch. His ways were not bad, but they were not altogether good until they brought him across Dunmaya, the daughter of a Rajput ex-sub-Major major of our native army. The girl had a strain of Hill blood in her and, like the Hill women, was not a Pertinashian. Where Phil met her or how he heard of her does not matter. She was a good girl and handsome, and, in her way, very clever and shrewd, though, of course, a little hard. It is to be remembered that Phil was living very comfortably, denying himself no small luxury, never putting by an Anna, very satisfied with himself and his good intentions, was dropping all his English correspondence one by one, and beginning more and more to look upon this land as his home. Some men fall this way, and they are of no use afterwards. The climate where he was stationed was good, and it really did not seem to him that there was anything to go home for. He did what many planters have done before him, that is to say, he made up his mind to marry a Hill girl and settle down. He was 27 then, with a long life before him but no spirit to go through with it. So he married Dunmaya by the forms of the English church, and some fellow planters said he was a fool, and some said he was a wise man. Dunmaya was a thoroughly honest girl, and, in spite of her reverence for an Englishman, she had a reasonable estimate of her husband's weaknesses. She managed him tenderly and became, in less than a year, a very passable imitation of an English lady in dress and carriage. It is curious to think that a Hill man, after a lifetime's education, is still a Hill man, but a Hill woman can, in 6 months, master most of the ways of her English sisters. There was a coolie woman once. But that is another story. Dunmaya dressed by preference in black and yellow and looked well. Meanwhile, the letter lay on Agnes's desk, and now and again she would think of poor, resolute, hard-working Phil among the cobras and tigers of Darjeeling, toiling in the vain hope that she might come back to him. Her husband was worth 10 Phils, except that he had rheumatism of the heart. 3 years after he was married, and after he had tried Nice and Algeria for his complaint, he went to Bombay, where he died, and set Agnes free. Being a devout woman, she looked on his death and the place of it as a direct interposition of Providence, and when she had recovered from the shock, she took out and reread Phil's letter with the etc., and the big dashes, and the little dashes, and kissed it several times. No one knew her in Bombay. She had her husband's income, which was a large one, and Phil was close at hand. It was wrong and improper, of course, but she decided, as heroines do in novels, to find her old lover, to offer him her hand and her gold, and with him spend the rest of her life in some spot far from unsympathetic souls. She sat for 2 months alone in Watson's Hotel, elaborating on this decision, and the picture was a pretty one. Then she set out in search of Phil Guerin, an assistant on a tea plantation with a more than usually unpronounceable name. She found him. She spent a month over it, for his plantation was not in the Darjeeling district at all but nearer Kangra. Phil was very little altered, and Dunmaya was very nice to her. Now the particular sin and shame of the whole business is that Phil, who really is not worth thinking of twice, was and is loved by Dunmaya, and more than loved by Agnes, the whole of whose life he seems to have spoiled. Worst of all, Dunmaya is making a decent man of him, and he will be ultimately saved from perdition through her training.